Okay, I think we can get started now. Welcome to Pubkey. Welcome back. We have a great talk for you tonight. This is HRF. We've got Roger Huang, who is a journalist, author. We're going to be talking about Bitcoin and China, and joining with him will be Alicia Maldonado, the head of communications for HRF, also a journalist. And I learned the two of you have just met about a month and a half ago and have become besties. So I'm looking forward to this talk. I also want to thank Bitcoin Magazine for streaming this event. And thank you all for coming to Pubkey tonight.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Which side do you want?
I'll take a side.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a privilege to be here with my new best friend, Raj. Yeah, as Daniel was saying, I met Raj in the Bitcoin conference at the end of July, and he quickly ascended the ranks to become the second most ridiculous person I've ever met in my entire life, right behind my mother. So he's in good company. So we're going to talk about his book. I'm going to try to hold the mic and these things at the same time. It's called When Mao Hold Bitcoin. And as I like to joke around, my boss wrote the foreword, and so if that's as far as you get into Roger's book, you're good. By Alex Gladstein. Anyway, so we're going to talk about China, mostly Raj's, and thank you to our financial freedom team, Christian, and all those guys for giving me the great privilege to talk to you, Raj. So let's just jump right in, and maybe you can give us the cliff notes of your book first.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks so much, Pubkey, for having me, and for Bitcoin Magazine for streaming the event. And Alicia, thank you so much for moderating. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for all the people who are attending, either virtually or physically. The cliff notes of my book, how do I sum up a quite complex topic, China and Bitcoin? So it starts off in the 1980s in China, which you probably wouldn't expect, because you're like, well, where's the Bitcoin part of that? But I think that the early foundation of Chinese economic history and just all the cycles of inflation, China was the first country to come up with paper money. And throughout all these cycles, you can see throughout the history the kind of effect that inflation has had on politics, on so many people throughout their lives. China in the 1980s was also a fight between two factions of the Chinese Communist Party, one that has won out and is now currently the faction that is in control of the country, and by default, the second largest economic power in the world. So I thought it was a very important part to start there. I go into the history, interviewed a couple of the, I guess you could say, OGs in the Bitcoin scene in China, really got a sense of how they met each other and created different businesses, whether that was the first exchanges, because Mt. Gox didn't accept renminbi deposits, whether that was the first, kind of mining equipment providers, the ASIC providers, or whether that was the mining pools that came out of China as well. And then I go really into kind of the story and the history of what exactly is going on with China and Bitcoin. Like, is it banned? Is it not banned? What exactly is happening, right? Why is it banned if it is banned? How does the Chinese Party State think about it? Is it possible it's going to get unbanned? And then at the very end, what I do is kind of talk about how Bitcoin and China are sort of two characters in a larger story. And really, it's about state-driven development, top-down versus bottoms-up, freedom, tech, and adoption. Obviously, I'm here now, and you all see me, and I'm wearing like a Bitcoin propaganda hat, so maybe you can guess kind of what team I'm on. But I want to say that it was just like such a pleasure to study and research all these different elements. And I was telling someone earlier before I started talking, like I'm still researching because it's still such a black box. Even like I've done a lot of research in the space, but I feel like there's still so many stories, still so many threads, and still so many companies and different people that are part of this kind of history that still can unearth their stories and share a little bit more and help us learn a little bit more about Bitcoin, why it matters, as well as the Chinese political context and the geopolitics and technology of our age. I'll end off by just saying, people always ask me, why did you write the book? And I've always said that A, I wanted to learn myself. That's how I try to absorb. But B, I really thought of Bitcoin and China as almost like two characters in a larger saga. And the larger question is, what technology and what innovation model and what kind of politics and technology do we want for the 21st century writ large, right? And I think China, in contrast to open source development and sometimes in collaboration, shows that juxtaposition so very clearly. So yeah, that's kind of the cliff notes, I guess.
Well done. Well, before we get into the tuck into the crypto and Bitcoin bit, can you just paint a picture of China for us from Mao to now, not intentionally rhyming?
Yeah,
Was
I
not
mean,
deliberate.
people were like panning me because they were like, "Hey, you're trying to write a book on a really complex topic, Bitcoin. So why don't you add another complex topic
Let's
that no
throw
one
in Mao.
understands, which is China?"
And who is that guy? Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, how do we start with this? So the way I explain in the book, so originally the part of Chinese history was actually like 3 chapters, but then my editor was like, "You're crazy. Like, what are you doing?" We got really deep into like Chinese history in the 1980s. That's kind of like a fascinating kind of like pet hobby. And so for those who don't know, after Mao Zedong, well, so let's actually start with the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution was kind of a way for Mao Zedong to set who his successor would be. And it was this factional battle, and a lot of the current leadership generation of China, their parents, including Xi Jinping's father, and Deng Xiaoping were actually purged during that time. But they came back and they took power. When they took power, they decided to change China's economy completely. China's economy previously, it was illegal for you to have companies with more than 5 people employed. There was no private enterprise. It was a complete command economy. There were people's communes and everything related to that. And so it was just a completely different context. And a lot of people now, I think, struggle with, like, is China capitalist? Is China socialist? Like, a lot of people ask me this. And part of the confusion comes from that period of history. I think that's why it's so important. So when Deng Xiaoping took power, there was this period called reform and opening up. And that is when the Chinese leadership decided to embrace what they now call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And namely, there are private markets, there are stock markets, there are many of the tools you would associate with capitalism, but it's all firmly under the party state's control. Meaning it's still Marxist-Leninist in terms of the politics, but the economics of it are much more mixed. So China now comes from that root. And I think that you can't really understand what's happening and why China now is the 2nd largest economy in the world without understanding that root conflict. One thing I wrote about in the book that people don't understand as well is that period of time actually came with a really big period of inflation. Because what happened was there was price reforms. Under the Maoist regime, there was no price changes. Like, prices were fixed, literally. And then when prices were allowed to float, at some points, inflation was at an annualized rate of 18.5%. There were like goods flying off shelves and all kinds of things. This is a very new thing to people in China. It wasn't the principal cause of the Tiananmen Square protests, but it was a reason for why there was a lot of economic disquiet at the time. Oh, sorry.
What years did they have like 18%
1986 to 1987, yeah, around that time. It was approximately right before, like 1985 to like 1987. And so there was that period of time where there was inflation, and this was new, and this actually, there was a fight between these 2 factions of the Chinese Communist Party. So the reformers had won. There were economic reformers had won. They had decided to embrace capitalism and certain tools. Deng Xiaoping famously said, "It's glorious to get rich. It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or if it's a white cat. All that matters is if it catches mice," right? This is something that Bitcoin people in China still say, but they say that about their tokens. They're like, doesn't matter if it's a black token or a white token, as long as it makes me whatever yield exists or whatever. But so that is kind of the context of that. And then within the reformer faction, though, there's pretty much like everyone is agreed on like changing the economy, right? This is the root of China's explosive economic growth. Before, during the Cultural Revolution, China's GDP per capita was a few $100s per capita, which is about the same as North Korea. In between those years, China grew economically very quickly because private enterprise was allowed. People were allowed to make their own businesses. People were allowed to profit. And the issue then became that there were 2 factions. One that wanted to do political reform along with economic reform. So the idea was to have freedom of the press. The idea was to have maybe some elections, at the local level or other things. There were reformers who, one of them actually said, Huang said, there is nothing we can learn from Mao Zedong, which is quite a bold statement because they built the whole party state on Mao's legacy still. Even though Deng Xiaoping was terribly persecuted by Mao, he still maintained that Mao had built the Chinese nation. That is why Mao's portrait still hangs in the great halls of Beijing. But these two factions ultimately culminated during Tiananmen Square. This is why I say, one of the things I write often about is about Tiananmen Square writ large. And the physical commemorations and everything related to that is a big part. The fact that virtual commemorations are repressed to a certain degree, and even across borders, is also an important element. But something that most people don't realize, it was actually the loss of a progressive faction. So Tiananmen Square happened because Hu Yaobang, who I mentioned, who was the leader of the reformers at the time, someone who wanted both political and economic reforms, he was sidelined because there were student protests, and he was seen as not being hard enough in the protest. And part of the reason why there were student protests at the time was because of the economic changes that were happening. So there was all this cycle, and then during Tiananmen Square, that culminated. Basically, the hardliners that won out were the ones who endorsed political violence, were the ones who firmly established or wanted the state to be in control of the economy, even as there were economic liberalization. And so the book kind of, at least in the first chapter, kind of ends off on that note because you still do see those signs in China today. This is very much still like a live debate, right? I'll end off with a quote from one of my favorite books, Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Tyne. And the whole idea is, the Chinese people have been so deprived for so long throughout famine, throughout, the Cultural Revolution, throughout 10 years of suffering. Don't we deserve political and economic freedoms? Can we not eat from that same bowl? And I think that, that moment established a path where economic freedoms were given, or some of them were given, but political freedoms were firmly entrenched in the hands of the party.
We're going to get to the question that you ask yourself on the front of your book, but I was in DC this last weekend, and I was talking to a journalist about your book and this event that we were hosting tonight, and he said that it wasn't just the question, would Mao hold Bitcoin, but would Mao have wanted Bitcoin to be created, or would he have wanted other people to own it? The obvious answer to that is no, because it goes against his policies and his ideologies. But he said that he really believed that Mao would hold Bitcoin because he wouldn't want someone to have something that he didn't. What is your take on that? And do you think that he would have seen the strategic value of Bitcoin, even if it was just for his own benefit?
Yeah, I want to say first of all, the title is not it's kind of like a little bit of an accident, and I'm happy that it's inspired a million shower thoughts. People have memed it, because you all know that Mao the symbol for Mao is also Mao cat, in Mandarin, and so people. Okay, well hopefully you all know at least that part now.
Now we know.
But yeah, people have replaced the cover with a cat, and it's been one of those things. So I don't want to say it's an accident, but originally I called the book "One Country, Two Blockchains," which if any of you, which is probably more obscure than anything than even this. And then they were like, you should probably change that because I don't think anyone will understand it. So I gave them two options. One which was so obscure, it was even more obscure. It was red lasers over China, which is a reference
really
to
selling it.
Yeah, a reference to an Edgar Snow book that he wrote. I don't even know if anyone knows here Edgar Snow, but anyways, an American writer who wrote about China way back in the day. And then I was like, well, why don't I just throw something spicy? What is the one thing that American people know about about China? And it's Mao. But what I've actually become increasingly surprised by is younger people don't actually know who Mao is. So may not be working 100%.
Unbelievable.
But now that we're on the top of the book, I've had to put a lot of thought into it because I couldn't write would Deng Xiaoping hold Bitcoin because no one
would know who that is.
No one knows who that is. But having now written the title and being asked about it several times, I think the first answer I always give is that you have to remember Mao was a rebel too. He lived in the caves. He had a little bit of a period of time where he was not in the mainstream, let's say, right? Where he was running in the Long March and all these other things. So he was in the caves with all the other people of the Long March, the veterans. So there were definitely periods of time where he was on the outs, and I think he would have appreciated something like Bitcoin. But of course, Mao is also a communist, command economy, someone whose first act was land reform that involved the violent murder and disappearance of many landlords. But one of the things in the Cultural Revolution was they talked a lot about capitalist roaders. And I certainly think that most Bitcoiners would be regarded as capitalist roaders or worse, I think. Capitalist roaders being people who are leaning towards capitalism, like Deng Xiaoping. And we're talking about like people who are like, maybe this Keynes person has like some validity to his theories, right? So now you're talking about, we should have money without the state, and we should just like run everything with markets. So I think Mao probably wouldn't have liked that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. He never, yeah, like they didn't have like private enterprise with like, it was all communes.
Makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the book, you really drive home the point that China played a central role in Bitcoin's growth. And you say that, you know, if anywhere in the world that Bitcoin became from hobbyists on a computer to like a global saleable technology, it's in China. So, you know, can you talk about that more? And perhaps segue into why then China keeps trying to ban Bitcoin or banned it, trying to ban it. What has it banned? So the question is, you know, creating its growth and then trying to shut it down.
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to kind of clarify is like China is a lot of things. I mean, I think it depends on like what you mean by China in a particular context.
Yeah.
Of course, China is this and China is that. But I also like to think, you know, Chinese people are like there's so many different Chinese people, different perspectives. I've had the pleasure of talking to a lot of them about Bitcoin specifically as part of the book. And so that's been really great. I think that a lot of Chinese people were part of the initial wave of like the maturation of Bitcoin. If we talk about like the first large exchanges, right? The first large like on-ramps, Binance, Huobi, OKX. People forget FTX. I mean, now these are all like, but like FTX had its roots in Hong Kong and stuff like that. And whatever you think about them, like they definitely onboarded a lot of people onto Bitcoin early on. The mining equipment, so definitely China was this very unique moment where, you know, Bitcoin was shifting from being mined by GPUs to being mined by specialized equipment. And it so happened that China, you know, in Shenzhen and other places, with the internet cafe culture that existed there, and the fast manufacturing of smart hardware, ended up being the perfect place to be able to design these chips. And it still has that dominance. Like, you know, like Bitmain is still like such a giant in the space, right? And then from the mining equipment providers, as these ASICs came on, they became basically the only way you could really mine. And so all the infrastructure that was required for that, right? Like the pools that allow you to smooth out the variability of Bitcoin mining. The exchanges that allow Bitcoin miners to be able to interact with other people and say like, hey, I want to sell Bitcoin or buy Bitcoin. So I really believe that Chinese entrepreneurs, and I interviewed a few of them, you know, I got a couple of character quotes from Bobby Lee and a couple of the originals. You know, Bobby claims that he invented the word B2B, which is like the Mandarin symbol for Bitcoin, but I wasn't able to corroborate that, but I did put that in the book. You know, like they were a really big part of that. And even early on, actually, like Baidu was like accepting Bitcoin for like some of their services and things like that. So, you know, there's Chinese people and then there's a Chinese state. Now, what has happened as different, and we'll get into this into like slightly more technical detail, but like as different parts of the Chinese state have tried to, you know, do different things with Bitcoin, there have been what you could call like a ban or a moratorium on certain elements, kind of like escalating from 2013 to like 2021, right? And so the Chinese party state is also kind of doing its own path on this. What you could term a ban, I think writ large. I mean, we'll get into like what's actually banned, what's actually not banned, what does that really mean. But so first, the people are not the government. And Chinese people have such vast views. And by the way, I always love like throwing this together because like, you know, I try to get the widest views possible. So I met someone who was like an OG Bitcoin miner in China. He's like, yeah, the digital yuan's gonna win. Like, y'all are gonna see like the digital yuan, it's gonna be #1. And I'm like, whoa, that's like kind of a wild view. And then I met someone who's like, you know, I think Bitcoin is going to like caused the downfall of the CCP, and like, you know, there's like people like that exist as well. So it's a very wide view, very, very wide. And so among the Chinese people, you know, there's even very different views. And then, you know, we talk about the Chinese Party state, even though it does seem very unified, there are like different parts of the government. Initially, Bitcoin, so first of all, Xi Jinping, I don't think has ever made, I guess I would know because I kind of be the authority on this, but like, I don't think has made a public statement per se on Bitcoin. He's made a lot of public statements on blockchain. He loves blockchain. I don't know why, but he loves blockchain.
Because you control it?
Yeah, they can raise state guidance funds, and there's all this stuff. So there's a lot of Chinese blockchain people. It's very interesting. And then Chinese Bitcoiners sometimes make fun of those people. But then, anyways, so all the gradations of Bitcoin discourse that you have come to love and enjoy on Twitter and X also exist on these like Discord and like WeChat groups. But the Chinese government is also a little bit, I think, we'll talk about a little bit on the mining as well. I mean, there are different people in the government as well. Mm-hmm. It's not so much to say like there are people who are against or for it, but there definitely are slightly different views in some respects. Mm-hmm. Certainly, overall, the government is against it, but there are local government officials that are benefiting from Bitcoin mining and may still continue to be doing so. And there are, you know, previously senior officials at China Central Bank that have stepped up and said, I support Bitcoin and blockchain, right? There's some Hong Kong legislators that are very I mean, again, they're not pro-Bitcoin, but they're pro-crypto or pro-Web3 or pro-digital assets writ large. So there is a little bit of division.
Roger,
Yeah,
Frank has a question over here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, this is like a whole different topic, but thankfully I also write about this sometimes. So Matt Pines wrote a review of my book, and I highly encourage you all to find him, Matthew Pines, on like, you know, all the podcast spheres and stuff like that. But there's pass-through imports. So the Biden administration sanctions have not actually been that effective, is in general. China has not been able to build domestically the newest generation, which is the 3 nanometer, which are still Taiwanese. So it's TSMC that has that, and that's where Bitmain gets its exclusive spot. Also, where Jack is getting his exclusive spot is through IBM's 3 nanometer quota with the same company. So China is missing this is gonna get really technical, but it's missing the lithography. So, okay, so the short of it is they're missing some equipment that Japan and the Netherlands provide. So the US has been really leaning on Japan and the Netherlands. But the question was that what's going on with GPUs and CPUs? How is China managing that? And I guess my answer to that, the simple answer, is the sanctions haven't really worked. And there's ways to pass through, and Middle Eastern countries are able to sell like access to GPUs or access to CPUs or other things. Yeah. Sorry, almost got taken to a way sidetrack to my other. Yeah, I haven't actually written an article for them, but I also write about AI, ML, and like semiconductors.
You do it all, mate.
Yeah, trying to do everything.
And you succeed. So you also talk in the book, and this is kind of tangential to the previous question, but that China's the largest economy to pursue the quickest and most draconian restrictions on Bitcoin and crypto. Can you talk about some of those Beijing's counter moves? And I'm thinking things like CBDCs and the digital yuan. And can you also talk about the international implications of those, you know, countermeasures to block it?
Yeah. Okay. Now I feel bad. I'm gonna sum it up really. Okay. So 2013, you know, they forbade Chinese banks from using it. 2017, they banned ICOs. 2021, they banned. They said mining was bad for the whole of Chinese society, and a lot of the provinces created plans to ban Bitcoin mining. And then also, they banned Bitcoin exchanges. And they also said that if you were a Chinese citizen working for an over-the-counter exchange overseas, they would come and arrest you. And this happened to like a few people. So that's kind of like the level of bans in China. In the book, it's presented a little bit more, you know, but I'm just trying to
Take your time. We're all listening to you.
Hit you on the top there. But that has been what has been happening with kind of like the Bitcoin bans per se. So those are like the counter moves from China directly. They've done other things. I mean, you know, some of the other stuff, I wrote this article that kind of summed up how Bitcoin was able to escape or evade a lot of these levels of bans, right? Like, they took down like KOLs or influencers, but it doesn't really matter. Like, if you removed all of Bitcoin Twitter, no offense, like, I think Bitcoin would still be running, right? So, like, so, yeah.
KOL and whatever.
Oh, sorry, KOLs is like the Asian term for like influencers. Yeah, so so it's like key opinion leaders. Yeah, so it's like influencers. But you know, imagine we had a world where everybody on Bitcoin Twitter just disappeared, but like Bitcoin would still be running blocks, right? So similar to that, I mean, in China, it's not like everybody who's banned. Like, it's not like a instant block. Like, you're not like instantly banned or whatever. I have heard of a few stories of people getting suspended from their WeChat because they mentioned like Bitcoin in their DMs and stuff like that. So that does happen to a certain degree. But there's those kind of level of bans as well. But the strongest counter move China has done is to try to propagate a system of digital payments, both either WeChat Pay or Alipay overseas, or the digital yuan. So I was one of the first writers to write about the digital yuan, the ECNY. So people ask me about that all the time. The digital yuan is the world's most advanced central bank digital currency. Research started on it in 2014. Mu Changchen, who's kind of the current the research director at the People's Bank of China, used to be a bank regulator. The short of what's happened with the digital yuan and the international implications of that, I think that there's three things that are happening right now that China's trying to fight for. First, there's the domestic retail payments infrastructure in China. And by retail payments, I mean the way people pay and receive money in China. Right now, 94% of the market share is WeChat Pay and Alipay. If you all have ever been to China, it's actually quite difficult in many of the tier 1 cities, meaning the larger cities, to spend cash in different places. Digital payments are very dominant as an option. And so the Chinese party state is trying to control its domestic infrastructure in terms of payments. I think that one of the things they're trying to do, they're very focused on merchant transaction fees. So their bet is that if we put merchant transaction fees to 0%, because effectively a central bank digital currency, the digital yuan, it's a direct stake to the central bank. The central bank can essentially print it. It is not broad money. It is not money that goes through and is intermediated by banks in the Chinese system. It is direct to the central bank. And so with the central bank digital currency, with the digital yuan, you know, the play, I think, is to try to not displace the Alipay and WeChat Pay, but to kind of present like an alternative. I think that the Chinese party state is thinking that there's going to be more payments that are done agent to agent, like in AI form. So that's been something that's come up. And so you want to have 0% transaction fees on that, right? So the state can impose its own transaction fees. One of the reasons why that hasn't worked as well is China's really interesting because there was a theory that because Alipay and WeChat Pay had so much dominance that they would be able to charge merchants a lot of money in transaction fees. But that hasn't actually really happened. And the reason is that they've been able to sell ancillary services. So like, for example, Alipay uses like its lending platform. So it's not only just a payments platform, it's also a credit lending platform as well. It does lending through small businesses and things like that. And so because of that, the average merchant transaction fee in China is really quite low, between 0.3 to 0.6%, versus on credit card or on debit card in the United States or North America, it's approximately 3% or 2.9%, I believe, on average. And so the domestic retail payments environment in China is something that the Chinese party state is thinking about. I think it would probably be their preference that the digital yuan get like a little bit more. They've been saying they don't want to replace Alipay or WeChat Pay, but I think it would probably be the government's preference that more people use the ECNY. They've been doing a lot of like airdrops. They've been doing a lot of, they like text people. They're like, you just got a free amount of like ECNY and you have 14 days to spend it. So there have been a lot of those pilots, right? There's a lot of positive state media mentions. So definitely something they're trying to push. I think despite their protests, I mean, in general, I found writing about the Chinese Party State, like what they tell you they don't want to do is generally what they want to do. So I think the domestic retail payments ecosystem is something. But at the end of the day, WeChat and Alipay, Tencent, and Alibaba are still companies that are subordinated to the Chinese Party State, even though they're not the Chinese Party State itself. But the banking system is a little bit more tightly regulated in China, and the Chinese Party State is a little bit more used to dealing with that. I think there's a little bit of a sense that the tech sector is a little unreliable for those following to a lot of the IPOs in China have been denied recently. And we had the whole thing with Jack Ma where he kind of disappeared for a little bit as well, right? And that was because of his criticism of the Chinese financial system. So that's there in terms of the retail, the domestic retail. You mentioned the international impact. I think that's where that's really interesting. So the wholesale payments infrastructure, I think the play is to make it like a BRICS SWIFT alternative. So for those who don't know, SWIFT is kind of the financial plumbing of the world. The US dollar system and the correspondent banking system basically means that for most banks, you're trying to flow, because a lot of companies have liabilities or assets denominated in US dollars. And so you usually touch some kind of rail in the US banking system, no matter what country you're in, right? And this is also reinforced by the fact that most commodities trade against the US dollar. Alex writes a lot about this, but that's like the petrodollar, right? And that's the whole extension of it. There have been signs, so the Chinese yuan, the digital yuan, they are trying to pilot it with the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub. So the Bank of International Settlements is the central bank for central banks. Don't have enough time to cover all the intricacies of that. Great book, I think it's called Tower of Babel, if you're interested in understanding how the BIS works. But in general, it is a central bank for central banks. And that innovation hub is trying to create central bank digital currencies across the world. And so the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have signed on to the Chinese mBridge project. What is the mBridge project? It is a quote unquote it's a digital, central bank digital currency. One thing I should make clear is that the Chinese state tried a quote unquote blockchain approach, they decided against it. So it's not like a distributed ledger technology, it's just literally like a ledger, a database that they run like with local vendors. It's closed source, they choose the vendors and everything related to that. Now, the central bank digital currency is being used to settle trade for oil. And so Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates has sold oil, small amounts, I think it was like 90 million, whatever their currency is. But it is a significant step. It's definitely a transaction outside of the US petrodollar. Every time when people are talking about, oh, is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are they trying to break away from the US petrodollar? This would be the most tangible example. They are using the digital yuan to settle trade of oil to China. Conceivably, countries like Russia and other countries the United States does not like and is sanctioning will do the same. And then the last element that I think is really underrated, is there's growing internationalization. I think the digital yuan is not going to work internationally in the sense of international retail payments, because most people are just going to be like, this is like there's already US bills out there where they're like, we're going to preemptively ban this, right? Because it's just too close to the government. Like you're not going to let like the United States or other countries in the allied blocs are probably not going to let like a digital yuan transact. But Alipay and WeChat Pay are getting a lot of traction. And sometimes I wonder if is it like a Huawei kind of thing that's like kind of going under the radar? Because you're talking about like financial payments. So Alibaba actually sponsored the Euros, the UEFA Euros. And when I looked into that a little bit deeper, it's because they're trying to actually consolidate European payment standards. So imagine that. You're like, you have a Chinese company that's trying to consolidate all the standards for your payments infrastructure in a country, right? Now, I don't think it's like, I'm not trying to be like one country or another. I actually don't really, on the geopolitical side, should you ban ByteDance or Huawei for just being Chinese in itself? But, these are companies with deep links to the party. And so you have to wonder kind of what's going on here. There, I do see success. Like, I noticed it first, kind of creeping up, but there have been organic merchant adoption because people are trying to get payments from the reverse situations, people from China who are spending money outside. And I think that can be wonderful for people, but I also do wonder the implications of like do you want your payment rails to be controlled by a company that is based in a jurisdiction that leans very heavily on companies to do its bidding, or do you want it to be run, I mean, I'm wearing the hat, and a lot of you are in the audience, and some of you are working on this very directly, by standards and platforms. I think it's standards and platforms.
One of the things I find interesting throughout the book is that there's just so many things going on at the same time in China. China playing a central role in the growth of it, China trying to ban it, China trying to create countermeasures. In other pieces of your journalism, you talk about how China doesn't really actually understand Bitcoin or crypto, or that they just don't actually quite know what's going on. How can all of these things be happening simultaneously?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to add too. China's a bad designated driver. You know, like.
Go on.
But like, so, I mean, this is the difficulty of it. Is like when you write for a headline, you have to say like China or the country, because no one's gonna be like Liu He from like the State Council and the Vice Premier said.
Right,
you know,
right.
nobody. Again, we're going back to the whole.
They don't even know who Mao is.
They don't know who Mao is, right? So it seems confusing because we're talking about a lot of different people.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs who built great businesses that still have a role to play in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I think there are a lot of Chinese technical figures, like people in the central bank and other places, that are very against Bitcoin. But for that matter, there are a lot of central bankers in the quote-unquote West that also are against Bitcoin for some of the same reasons, right? The reasons are a little bit more accentuated in China because of the capital controls, because of the fear that people will exit the system, because of the human rights implications, because of the financial freedom aspect. But nevertheless, those arguments kind of persist, right? So I get that it seems very confusing, and hopefully my book doesn't confuse people and elucidates it a little bit more. But some of it can be explained by just like these are very different agents with different incentives and different motives.
It's a massive country. Let's talk about the Bitcoin culture in China.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you've learned from talking to Chinese Bitcoiners and those who are like working on Nostr and things like that? Because I know you've interviewed a number of people for the book as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some really cool people I met. Like, I'm gonna start off with those. You know, people who like, I always think it's really cool because it's like the roses that grow out of concrete a little bit. So I was born in China. I went back and forth, but I didn't like grow up there per se, right? I didn't grow up there. But there are people who grew up there who are very cypherpunk. There's some people that I cited in the book, and you can find them on Nostr, and they're talking about like, you know, they think Bitcoin and open source development is the way to go. They really believe in the decentralization element. They understand it too, right? And so there are people like that, which I always find really cool. And I don't want to underrate that. But the next thing I'm going to say is that there are few of those people. I went on Nostr, and I definitely checked out as many Mandarin language posts as I could obtain from it as part of my research. And people talk about like their day-to-day life on there as well. There are 2 or 3 people that talk about, for example, like there's a citizen whistleblower who's detained in Wuhan for reporting on what happened. And people will repost some of the things. One of the things she said that got her probably imprisoned was she had a sign that said, if we keep on going down this path, we will become North Korea. So someone reposted that. There have been 1 or 2 people who have posted about Tiananmen Square on Nostr. I don't want to underrate that. This is like very cool to see. Having said that, you know, on the Bitcoin culture side, I just don't think that, I had this discussion earlier on the Spaces, if some of you caught that, but you know, there's like different people in the Bitcoin world, and some people are like Bitcoin Ethereum leaners, I could say. Some people are Bitcoin Monero leaners, meaning like, do you really love the like token aspect? Do you really love the L2 aspect? Do you really love like, we're gonna build things with covenants and OPCAT and all this stuff? Or do you love like, you know, like the privacy element? Do you love like the cypherpunk? You know, these are not like necessarily contradictory, but writ large, I think there are like different schools. I do think a lot of the interest right now in China is very financially based. It's very, very financially based. The way I've started thinking about it is like in China, you do have to kind of rebuild the financial infrastructure from scratch. Like if you want to take like loans outside of the Chinese system, if you want to take everything out, you do require it to be, you know, you do require those ancillary services. So I can kind of see there's a lot of activity in terms of like L2s, people who are interested in like inscriptions, like BRC20 and stuff like that. I personally am like not really, you know, and there are some Bitcoin only people. I interviewed a couple of them. also to round that out. I'm personally not really quite there, but I can see why people from China are really focused on that element. One thing that people should be aware of is China's economy is doing pretty badly right now. There is deflation, which they're worried about. And the growth has been slowing. In absolute terms, they're aiming for a goal of 5%, which will be the slowest since 1976, which is when Mao Zedong died. And so times are pretty difficult, and there's not really like a return on your money. Like, you can't really invest in things in China. There's not really, Chinese stocks aren't doing that well. Chinese real estate is doing pretty poorly. It's down like 20 to 30% over the course of like a few years. And so people are really looking at like return. And so when I talk to people, I was in a space this morning, a couple of spaces before, like, they're always really interested in the return. Like, one of them had that quote, like, the black and white. They're like, I don't care if it's a black token or a white token. Like, if it makes money for me, like, that's where it's at, right? But I always think of it as like, that is like a form of like exiting the Chinese system, right? It's a form of saying like, I don't want to let the state dictate to me how my finances are run. I don't want the state to control, the money I make or where I want to spend or earn money, right? Or how I want to make my investment decisions. So I think of it in that way. And sometimes what I've said is that like, that is a meaningful form of dissent. Because the Chinese system is about making sure that the system is competent or seen as competent so that people keep their money in the system. One of the most meaningful things you can do, one of the scariest things of the Chinese government, is for you to exit the system. But the thing is that Chinese users of Bitcoin, they kind of come from a very different place. And I think this can explain some of the differences. Like, they can't really do stuff with custody. And that's a trade-off that people here or in other places I've seen like make very easily, right? It's like, oh yeah, I have like a provider that will help me, or I use like a mint or something like that. And I think in many cases, like, they have to self-custody, because in order for them to obtain the underlying asset, they have to trade it peer-to-peer, or they have to trade it in over-the-trade accounting errors, or they have to get it some other way, or they have to mine it or some other way. So I do think the culture is different, and that's kind of like the way like I've come to kind of understand it a little bit. But it's not anything that you won't have seen in like the gradations of Bitcoin dialogue in like here or anywhere else. I mean, God, I go to BitDevs and we have debates about like, like someone comes up and is like, Caspa is the best, and you're just like, oh, like there's this again. So it's not any different, I think, in that respect.
Yeah. I have 2 more questions for him, and then I'm going to give it to y'all. There's that y'all for you again. He thinks that Canadians say y'all. They do not.
Canadians do say y'all. Also, Canadians aren't as polite as you think it is. If I want to like represent Canadians, like writ large, I do want to say that.
He said earlier today that he's, Canadians say y'all, and I said I've been talking to you every day for a month and a half, and you've not said that word once. Anyway, let's talk about Bitcoin in the context of human rights, which is, of course, a passion at HRF, which is, Bitcoin as freedom money, and it allows people to skirt authoritarian regimes and all of that good stuff. And you've also said that the Chinese people have a real desire for a currency detached from the state. You were kind of just talking about that. But are you hopeful for the Chinese people in that regard, in this regard?
Yeah, I am. I'm long-term hopeful. I think I'm short-term a little bit pessimistic, because if you ever really interact with the Chinese internet, it is kind of a dark place. But then also I go on X or Twitter and I'm like, I don't really feel so great. So it's not necessarily restricted to just, we can't always be like, oh, this is specifically a China thing. But I think that right now the sentiment there is a little bit darker than I would expect. But I see kernels of hope in many ways. I think Bitcoin, first of all, I believe that Bitcoin will succeed, that Bitcoin will be the world's largest monetary network, that Bitcoin will be the default way of transacting. I happen to have those beliefs. I also have to say, I use the word hope, because that is not the conviction that things will go right, but that it is the right thing. And so for me, I really do come from that kind of point of view. I believe that for a number of different reasons, including the ability for people to make their own financial decisions and have their own freedoms, that Bitcoin will and has to succeed. I think that we're starting to see some of the kind of effects of that, some of the bouts, and it gives me optimism. It's like these small things, but like, for example, I met someone who was just like, hey, she's like, I grew up in China this entire time, and I just realized like WeChat Pay and Alipay are just totally spying on me. Like, what's the deal with that, right?
Yeah.
Like, people, it tends to be the case. I think a lot of people are coming to Bitcoin now in the Asian context from like a return perspective. But I also think that there are a lot of people who are getting intrigued by what does decentralization mean? What does that really mean? And they have all these constraints placed on them, so it really matters for them. There is censorship. People have been arrested for trading virtual currencies. There is that level of risk. And so people being able to actually circumvent that, I've seen those examples. My general sense is that the more knowledge there is, the better. And one of the things that gives me the most hope is actually going on Nostr to these different posts. And they don't even talk about Bitcoin, which is really fun. What they do is they tell each other, like, here's how you can evade the Telegram SMS block in China. Like, download the APK directly. Use things that have no KYC. And in that, I see, like, people putting GitHub repos of, like, education, people, like, translating resources, you know, books and things like that. And I think there's just, like, such a thirst for this knowledge and this education. It gives me just so much hope to see that people are willing to learn about what this is, even if the state doesn't. Yeah. And you know, I still think some members of the state might, but the people are so. Some of the people are just so interested in this, and it gives me so much hope for them and just our broader future.
Well, I think you kind of already answered my last question, which was going to see, you know, do you believe in the Chinese top-down model for creating innovation, beating out, you know, freedom tech approach, bottoms up, like Bitcoin and Nostr? But I think I already know your answer there. But if you'd like to go on about it, please do.
I'll make it really short. I think the freedom tech is going to win out. But again, believe in what's right, even if that doesn't end up being what ends up happening.
Cool. Well, do y'all have any questions for him? No?
I've got a mic here, so
Yeah.
Liz.
Thank you. This is super, super interesting. I have many questions, but
Okay.
I'll start with one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of Hong Kong. Obviously, there have been a number of human rights issues there. But more recently, Hong Kong was a host to the inaugural Bitcoin Asia conference. I was there. I was a speaker. I actually met members of the assembly who were working on Bitcoin startups and not crypto, Bitcoin.
Right.
I thought that was very interesting. The government provided the conference with a venue, and then, as you know, there was the approval of the Bitcoin ETFs in Hong Kong,
Sure.
also, I believe, with a connection to a Chinese state-owned bank. And a number of people had said there was a possibility that even mainland might open up a little bit more potentially as a hedge to the US dollar. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Sorry, Alicia, cut me off if it goes too long.
All right, okay.
But that's another element. It's I think it's almost like half a chapter of my book. But Hong Kong is different. So there is still in Hong Kong a system known as the Basic Law, which essentially I think will allow for Bitcoin to be legal and traded for tender regardless. So what you're just referencing directly what you're referencing on, the ETFs that were launched were spot ETFs. The three launchers, China AMC, Bolsera, and now I forget the other one. But Hashkey is the exchange. Bolsera worked with Hashkey. But they were all Hong Kong subsidiaries of mainland Chinese asset managers. In fact, among the top 15, top 10. There are legislators in the Hong Kong. Another thing that people should know as part of the human rights discussion that we're having, in Hong Kong, there is no more, quote unquote, there used to be a pan-Democrat faction. They all quit, and many of them are arrested. One thing I should mention in the context of Hong Kong that it makes me personally sad is even people who are not politically involved have seen many of their friends be arrested beyond just the core group of the Hong Kong 48. So please free the Hong Kong 48 while we're on the topic. But Hong Kong itself is a little bit different. There is the ability to have a little bit more latitude there was a professor that actually criticized the Chinese Bitcoin mining ban from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So it's a little bit different, and there are people who are operating in a Bitcoin space, and there are still 1,000 places where you can trade over the counter for Bitcoin and or Tether. And in fact, yeah, like there's still a lot of activity happening there. So sorry, does that answer your question? Or I know there's like a lot of different elements.
Part of my impression was that the idea was to make Hong Kong a little bit more of this.
Digital assets hub.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
competing with Singapore,
Correct.
which is now going for that and having more regulatorily friendly environment, in part because a lot of the
Yeah.
finance industry left
Right.
Hong Kong as a finance terminal.
Yeah, I'll touch on that briefly. I actually have an article that's coming out about that. So I interviewed Hashkey, and they said that, for lack of a better word, it's more optics. I think it's more like they're trying to get businesses to really flow in from an FDI perspective. Because you're correct, like a lot of the finance industry, like China has seen the most outflows of finance since the 2015, 2016. They had a little bit of a crisis then as well. I do believe they were saying that like Hong Kong's trying to position itself as a digital assets hub versus Singapore, but it's actually very difficult to open a bank account as a Hong Kong business associated with crypto writ large. So it remains to be seen. I think it's a little bit more optics. And then at the end, they said that the mainland Chinese were not allowed to invest in the Hong Kong spot Bitcoin ETFs. And so I think we're still very far away from mainland Chinese being able to invest through Hong Kong.
Any other questions?
What are people actually using as the tools to access and use Bitcoin in China? You know, you were saying they have to kind of be sneaking around, and there's no custodian, so they're doing self-custody and over-the-counter trades and all that. Like, what are the actual things they're using to accomplish that?
Yeah, I mean, some of them just like they use exchange accounts, but they just put a fake address. Because if they're, you know, if they put a Chinese address, they're technically banned in all the exchanges. So that's like one way they deal with it. You know, other people are just using tools. I mean, it's been interesting to me because even seeing people on Nostr, they use desktop clients like Iris and other things because those can't really be tracked or taken down by the App Store. And so I think it's a combination of, you know, exchange accounts. One thing is that Tether on Tron is quite a bit more, like, is quite a bit more, it's hard to tell because like exact numbers, you know, but Tether on Tron seems to be very popular. And so that's also like another kind of tool that they use in terms of like different wallets that correspond to that. There's a lot of like OTC exchanges, like peer-to-peer kind of stuff. They just like ping on WhatsApp, and then they have like either an exchange account that's like registered overseas, or they have like some kind of wallet infrastructure. I suspect we'll never get any of them on the record, but if any of you can, let me know that a lot of the OGs are running. Because one of the things with the spot Bitcoin ETF was they were like, we're gonna have in-kind redemptions. And I'm like, you don't know how, and everybody got really hyped, and I'm sorry, like a lot of like good friends of mine too, and I'm like, you don't understand how like Chinese people think about this. They're like, I already got my money out of China through Bitcoin, like why am I trying to put it back in to Hong Kong, right? But they made a big deal out of it because they were like, there's all these Chinese miners, they must have like these steel plates, like we don't know, but I'm guessing it's like steel plates. One of the wildest stories I saw in terms of tooling is someone left with like a hardware wallet of 61,500 Bitcoin from China. And she got arrested by the Brit. And you know how everyone's like, the British have 61,500 Bitcoin? That's from that. Like, it's this like one woman who like left with a hardware key, and she just like literally just left. So I think it's a little bit all over. You know, there's like hardware keys, wallets. Wallets, I think it would definitely tend towards like desktop wallets. But mostly I would guess it's like exchange accounts. In Asia, I feel like Binance is actually what most people think of when they think of Bitcoin, or Tether, for that matter. So I think there's a lot of that, yeah.
Gerard?
I'm curious your thoughts on privacy layers and how they might help or hurt adoption in China.
Yeah, privacy layers is like really an interesting topic. You would think that, so first, like based off of like kind of like my research on it, most people are interested in the financial implications, right? So they take their own privacy risk in other ways. I mean, the VPN ban, for example, in China, it's not individuals that oftentimes get caught. And it's not really the individuals that take that much risk. I mean, if you do take risk, you might get some fines. it's definitely like frowned upon. But most of the like jail time sentences and fines are really for people who are providers of VPNs. So really the risk is more on people who are trying to run like large trading or exchanges or services, right? I don't know that privacy on the base layer of Bitcoin would matter as much for them. I do know that the Chinese Party State works with a company that's similar to chain analysis, but in a local context. And they do work with exchanges, and they are able to trace down. They've never named the exchanges, but I'm guessing it's all the exchanges that left China, right? So they are able to track down like on-chain transactions and figure out what's going on if they're motivated sufficiently enough. There's an article on my ChinaBitcoinBook.com that goes into it a little bit more detail. So certainly for those cases and other cases, I think like definitely having more privacy in the base layer would be important. I have seen some people use Lightning on Nostr, like a bunch of Chinese people zapping each other on Nostr, which I found really cool. And I've struggled to think about that, but I think that's kind of like a private-ish way to do it. Yeah, the base layer stuff is like really hard to tell. I feel like a lot of the Bitcoin still hasn't really been moved. May account for some of the whales that like people are talking about. And then if we see it moved, it would really be between like OTC desks or something, or like, you know, they're like kind of like doing it off exchange. So a little bit harder to speculate on that. But they're not like using, I guess like one thing I would say is like there's not like merchant adoption, or there's not people doing like peer-to-peer trade as frequently as you might do like here, or like I come from Vancouver where we're like using Bitcoin all the time, right? So there's definitely not that. But for the one-off trades, I think they have enough privacy that they want to use currently.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
China is really huge, really a really big place, and there's a lot of people there. And so when you talk about all of these things that you've researched and done, is this the dusting through just the large financial hubs, the Chicago, the New York, the LA, the Houston of China? Or are these, how far does this reach, this culture of Bitcoin reach down into the smaller circular economies, or to the smaller places where they understand it, or that they're starting to understand it, that they could grab hold of it, where it becomes a tool of, I don't want to say resistance, but you know what I'm saying, but
Resistance works.
something that makes it different.
Good question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, one thing is that affects journalism about China writ large. Some of you may know Evan Osnos, wrote a great book, Age of Ambition. They always say about him that he only interviews 2 people in Beijing. You know, that's always the thing about, you know, journalists from abroad. I would like to say that a lot of this, like, you know, where the meetups were, where the events were, they're like kind of like the hot spots in China. A lot of these discussions, you know, all the cities you would expect, the quote-unquote tier 1 cities, like Shanghai, Beijing.
Can you feel it? Can you see it? Can you feel it down the tentacles? Or is it going into?
I think one way it has been is mining has been really distributed. So the miners are very mixed they're very mixed. Like they may not necessarily be like the financiers of like the tier 1 cities or like things like that. So originally a lot of the OGs were most likely from the Chinese tech scene. A lot of the like traditional VCs and you know, Bobby's talked about in the book, like he's really talking to like the tech scene in China, which is really like Shanghai, Beijing, and like all these other different places, right? But I think that with the Bitcoin miners, you certainly see a little bit more variety of like where they're from. And it's more in those different provinces where there's like electricity and different areas. So I think there is some of that. But I will say one thing, I've been surprised, like on Nostr as well, actually. Like the conversations like talked about some like lower, quote unquote, lower tier cities. Like someone was talking about like Suzhou's metro station, and like this is what got excited for me about Nostr a little bit. Because when I was on Clubhouse, I also used to be on Clubhouse, and when it got really interesting was when you had the conversations of people outside of the mainland, kind of, because there is like this thing where like even when China and the United States meet, it's often like rooms of New Yorkers meeting rooms of people in Shanghai, who actually aren't that different from each other, honestly. the real magic is when you get people from like Gansu and where the other people in China don't even really know. So I actually grew up like not like on a farm, but like kind of in the like in the rural parts of China. My dad's family is now from the most famous place in China, which is a village outside of Wuhan.
Congratulations.
So you know, like seeing that culture is very different. I think there is some of that there, and then it seems to have bled through a little bit because in Nostr and in different places where people talk, like you do get these conversations about like Suzhou and stuff like that, and like I was always most excited about Clubhouse because on X or on Twitter, a lot of people like flip the firewall, but you get a lot of like U.S. China and blah blah blah. But like on Nostr, people are talking about like the Suzhou metro station and like you know like the delivery salaries of like smaller tier cities and like you know in Clubhouse we used to have people talk about like the local culture in Harbin. I think it was a little bit more out of pocket upstairs, but you know, like it was like more cities that you might not even have that much of an impression in. Like imagine you're grown, like we're all here, we're in New York City, right? And if I were to ask you all like, what is going on in Iowa right now? You'd all probably be like, I mean, some of you would probably just be like, I don't know what's going on, right? But I think it has bled through at least through that little bit. That's one of the things that excited me a little bit. Even though there hasn't been that many posts on Nostr, it got exciting because it was like these are people talking about like local places where like you don't get access to those people, and where journalists it would be very hard for them to get access to those people as well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation about Bitcoin has certainly spread to different places. I think in terms of it like bleeding down, again, like I think this is more like people who are in places that are a little bit more rural or in the outskirts. It's not necessarily the case that they have less eyes on them, if that makes sense. Because if they're overseas or they're posting things overseas, there always is going to be some level of scrutiny. In fact, you know, I know of reports of like people who have been surveilled because they make phone calls overseas or things like that, right? So by virtue of the fact that you're posting overseas or on overseas platforms, there already is some level of interest in you. I don't think it necessarily matters as much where you're from. But I will say that a lot of the conversation, so one of the things that happened, I actually talked about this more in the context of Clubhouse, which was this app a long time ago with like audio rooms and stuff like that. I ran the largest China room on Clubhouse. Sam, who's here, actually invited me to the platform, so thank you for that, Sam. But one of the things that came up was like, you know, we asked people if they got into trouble after the talks that they had, and there were some people who were called in from the police. They were told to go to the police station. It's called like heta, which means like you drink tea with the police. And so there definitely is that level. I do think that the conversations we have now, though, because what happened is China banned Clubhouse. But the thing is, when you say ban, again, actually we didn't get into that much detail about this because I was probably ranting and raving about other things. But
Go on down.
But you know, when you say ban, the easiest tool China can do is to tell the app stores like take this down. Apple has complied with like 1,000 or something app takedown requests from China, right? That's the easiest thing you can do. Is just literally say like every Bitcoin wallet or whatever that's like on an app store, take it down. But you can't remove what's called an APK. And what an APK is like you download it and you can download the app onto your phone despite not being on the app store, right? And so when we say like things are banned, like for example, Nostr, Damus is banned in China in the sense that the app is not available in the app store. And in the sense that the default relays that Nostr runs, which is the way that Nostr uses to communicate and run its app, are also banned by China. But that doesn't prevent you from connecting to a relay that is not banned. And so there is that like ability to circumvent. So when we say ban, like we have to be really precise about, there is not really a way for China to ban Bitcoin and Nostr, just like there is not really a way for China to ban email, unless they go like, you're talking about like banning the whole standard in the protocol at that point, right? So that's, you have to take some like really draconian steps.
Maybe do one or two more questions if there are any more. If not,
Oh, cool. Sam,
Go on,
you
Sam.
got a question?
So of course, you can choose not to answer this question.
Oh, okay. This is spicy already.
I already love it.
Yeah. So I've been following your work for many years. You clearly have an incredible mind. You also deeply care about history. I happen to know that you collect rare books. And you really, really appreciate preserving history and how we can look at this to understand the future. And so I really appreciate that you've written this book to help us take this into this particular space and actually apply that to really this technological moment we're in, where like everything about the world is about to change.
Right.
My question for you is like, what is your value system that really motivates you to do this? Because given that, you know, you have family that comes from China and is still there, like there is, you know, a trade-off and risk that comes to you deciding to speak so openly and advocate for these things. So if you could share a little bit about that and what motivates you to do that despite the risk.
I love the question, Sam.
Yeah, well, it's great because I brought 3 people who know me really well into this room, and of course we're gonna
We'll
end
talk
off,
later.
We're gonna end off on this note in front of however many people are watching on Bitcoin Magazine as well. No, listen, it's a question I get asked. I don't think so. First, I made a decision that I was pretty comfortable with about my relationship of like whether I was physically going to be in China. And then once you make that decision, the other decisions kind of come a little bit easier, is I guess what I would say about that. I was going to write about it more in like an essay format, but I think it's not an uncommon thing for many people. And I think one thing, it actually affects the discourse. Because one thing I'll say is that now, not just me or anybody with connections to China, but like writers writ large are being warned from a lot of the writing or journalism about China is going to degrade. I don't think I'm going to write a book about China again, unfortunately. And one of the reasons why is because China is now unsafe for writers, I think. And so if you look, for example, Washington Post just appointed a new correspondent for China, but she's based in Taipei. Some of the outlets I work with, they have moved gradually from Hong Kong to Taipei. It was a very difficult part of the conversation, but realistically it's something that I think about quite often. And I don't even want to frame it as like me or like personally how I think about it, but I just think in general that will affect the wider dialogue. I think the US will understand China less, and I think China will understand the US much less as well as a result. But yeah, so that's kind of like how I think about that. And my motivation was to learn as much about Bitcoin in China as possible. I write to learn. I started writing about Bitcoin in 2014, and I'm just so glad that I'm in this position where people are willing to like talk to me now. Some people. And if some of you are out there that are on my interview list, let me know. I've definitely had a few people turn me down. And maybe after this interview, they probably will have more reason to. But I think like that's been really interesting and fascinating. And I also we didn't actually touch on this, and I was going to bring this point, but I actually do have this conviction, I think personally, that it would be really cool to have societies or countries, I'm going to do more writing in this vein, I think, in the future, that are almost like Mao-proof. And it's an interesting thought because Mao caused so much suffering, even for China's current generation of leadership, to see them be able to, and I'm not comparing Xi to Mao in that way, actually. I don't think like Xi is violently, you know, he has a lot of bad things that he's done. What's happening with the Uyghurs is, I think, unforgivable. But, and I've done rooms with, you know, representatives who've had their family members kidnapped and things like that. So I definitely, you know, can strongly kind of put that. But I think that he hasn't caused the death of like 50 or 60 million people at once so far. But his path to power, like it's just so, like China went from the society where it's like, hey, like you had one person command everything and it went terribly for us. So let's, in 2 generations from now, go right back to that, right? So it's something to think about, and that's what I think drives me the most. I guess that's why I'm wearing the hat, and I guess that's why I'm speaking here. So yeah, that's kind of like my motivation. Learning, already have thought through the implications writ large, but also wanting to share knowledge and kind of bridge the gap between the 2 cultures. And then thirdly, I think it's kind of a romantic idea, but like maybe we can have all the goodies of some of the things of state power, you know, electricity, roads, but not necessarily have the potential for a tyrant to take over and lead us to war or famine or pestilence.
Go ahead, Liz.
Okay, cool. We have another question.
I've got lots.
Okay.
But I can just keep it at this. Do you think there's a path in the future for freedom and democracy in China, and will Bitcoin play a role?
Love it.
We're trying really hard to get me like, you know, I always said
Banned
that.
again.
I always said that like the thing that would do the most for the book. I actually told Ellen, my publisher, this. It's like, you know what would be the best thing for the book and the worst thing for me is to get like straight up in prison by the Chinese state.
It would be.
It would be the worst thing for me, but probably the
We
best
would
thing for the book.
advocate for you at HRF. Don't worry.
You have to. Well, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
I
we
would
got you.
hope
We
so.
got you. We
I
got
would
you covered.
hope so.
Let's get you
But,
arrested first.
okay, all right. Is there a path to freedom and okay, cool. But then Frank, so other people have questions too.
Did you answer the question though?
I did not answer the question. I'm trying to answer the question,
Thanks,
but I
thanks for the talk. So the question is, what do you think about Telegram as a platform? It's one of the leading platforms
We'll
for
come back to you.
crypto, and I don't know if in China people use it at all. And also about the recent arrest of Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram.
Oh, I wrote an article. Well, okay, let me make a short answer then, and I'll probably get back to the other question. So Telegram is used by Chinese groups. They do use it. It's kind of weird. It's actually like Telegram, Discord, and like WeChat a little bit, are where a lot of these conversations happen. I do think the Telegram arrest, I think, has much broader implications. I wrote like a whole article about it. You know, I think it just makes Bitcoin and Nostra indispensable. I don't think any country, France or Germany or Turkey or Canada for that matter, should have the ability to determine a platform and a network's rules. So that's kind of like my short answer to that.
Back to Liz's question.
And then do we want to answer the spicy question about freedom and
Oh,
democracy?
absolutely, we do.
Okay. Is there a path to freedom and democracy in China? I've had a lot of conversations with like a lot of the Minzudang, which is kind of like the democracy advocates in the Chinese movement. One of the things that strikes me is they are getting older. They're getting older, and the younger generation is tending to be more nationalistic and is tending to be a little bit more proud of the fact that the Chinese party state is the way it is. Like, I don't want to, so I'll start with that. I personally think there still is a path. I think that, I don't know what Bitcoin's role is to play in that. I think first that Bitcoin can serve an essential role for people who are trying to leave the system. So that's like first and foremost, and they're just already doing that, right? Whether or not it will fundamentally change the Chinese system, I'm not one of those people that is, you know, able to say, you know, this is when China will fail in 2040 or 2032 or 2031 or whatever that. Yeah, just the same way, like none of my articles are about Bitcoin's price. But if you ask me the question of, is there a path to freedom and democracy in China, I do believe there is. I think there are some things that make it a little bit more difficult. But I do believe that there are going to be circumstances. I do think that, like, currently, with what's happening, it might not just happen organically. You really need, like, something to kind of break, whether that's, like, an economic thing. But there's a lot of youth unemployment. Conceivably, if there's a war, that will be the first war that China will fight since 1979. I do think that the PLA is very ill-equipped and may actually be doomed in any war with Taiwan. I'm happy to talk about that. And so if that's the case, then I think the stakes kind of are much higher. I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully.
Yeah, works. Frank, did you have a question?
Yeah, last question, and I asked this because it was something you shared with me in Nashville about how you do your
It's
research.
another person who knows me.
Yeah, but I really want you to share
Collecting
this if you're comfortable sharing it, because I think it will, for me, it made me want to even more so read everything that you publish. Can you talk a little bit, I think it was about how you were doing research on Wuhan, how you were reaching out to people, and I say this because I think
God, Frank.
he's one of the best. No, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I really think this is he's really, really amazing at finding interesting sources for his pieces and getting through to people that I think a lot of journalists don't. So feel free to share or don't share.
I'll share, Frank, because you. So Frank and I worked on a really great piece together that was on Bitcoin Magazine, which like essentially alleged that Chinese state institutions were making local donations that were co-opting like American mayors. So it's a great read if you ever want to see it. You check it out. And we got a lot of sourcing for that. But so yeah, I guess like one of the things of this book, it's super difficult to get sourcing. Gotta do what you gotta do. Gotta go to conferences, drink with people, do all the thing. What Frank is alluding to is during Wuhan, when the crisis was happening. Well, to be fair, I didn't tell you the other part, which is we had some connections to like the medical people there that I was trying to rush to a couple of journalist friends. But yes, one way I did try to get sourcing about what was going on, although I never published an article about it, was I went on Tinder and I just directly like matched with like a bunch of people, including a nurse in Wuhan, who was giving me like, yeah. And
How good is that?
Yeah, and she was, and she, yeah.
Enterprising.
And she was giving like really good information too. She was like, no, it's like really bad here. And I'm like,
Understatement.
yeah. And I specifically was looking for people who were working as, anyways, whatever. Like,
That's so deliciously devious. I love it.
yeah, so I mean, now I guess that tactic is, I hope they teach that at J school, but that is.
So Roger Huang 101.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I am a really big fan of like, go to where the people are and like, try your best to like be like a spy
people
cam.
are on Hinge.
Yeah. No, they're not
Tinder.
on Hinge, they're on Tinder.
Tinder.
Yeah.
All right, brilliant. I love it. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Pubkey for hosting us. Thank you to Bitcoin Magazine for live streaming it. Thanks to my beautiful colleagues at HRF for asking me to do it. And Raj, I adore you. Thank you for being here with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you, everyone who's watching, and thank you, everybody who's here. Much love and
Buy the
support.
book, guys.
Yeah, do buy the book.
Buy the book.
So Roger's going to hang out with us for a little while. We'll have a book signing. We're asking for a $30 donation to Human Rights Foundation. That's payable via Lightning, via cash, or you can even donate online, hrf.org/donate.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Please hang out.
Yeah, just
Thank
hang
you.
out if you want. All right. Thanks,
You
everyone.
guys are awesome. Thank you.